Hello, my name is Vince Carr, National Councillor for Education for the American Guild of Organists, and I'd like to welcome you to this Pipe Talk on the organ music of Florence Price. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about an aspect of Florence Price's career that I find particularly inspiring, and then I'll speak more specifically about some of her organ works. Unless indicated otherwise, the photos and recordings that you will see and hear today are my own property. Thank you for joining me. Over the last few years, Florence Beatrice Price has become quite popular in the classical music world. This trailblazing African-American female composer struggled to receive the prominence she deserved in her day, but now, because of the efforts of so many, her work is finally receiving the recognition it deserves. Florence, or B, as her family called her, was a native of Little Rock, Arkansas, hometown of another great African-American composer, William Grant Still. Not only were Price and Still symphonic composers from the same town, their families were quite closely connected, as Still revealed in a letter several years after the death of Miss Price. In her youth, Price was already an immensely talented and proficient musician who attended the New England Conservatory. Despite being one of the brightest students, one must note the difficulty of being a young Black conservatory student at the turn of the 20th century. She was encouraged to suppress her Blackness in several ways in order to get ahead. One painful example is shown here in a recital program from the conservatory, where, despite obtaining the coveted final performance slot on the recital, she is still listed misleadingly as being from Pueblo, Mexico. But struggle was really a constant presence in her life, causing her to fight for just about everything she earned, and fight she did with incredible persistence. A smart and clever woman, she navigated her career in a way that was generations ahead of her time. She was the epitome of an entrepreneurial musician, something we might consider to be more of a 21st century paradigm. We see many examples of this entrepreneurial spirit in her life. She maintained close connections with patrons and kept diligent correspondence with them, encouraging them to invest in her career. Here, Illinois patron and music dedicatee Helen Andrews writes a letter to Price. Florence was also relentless in her pursuit as a published composer. We see here the composer John Alden Carpenter responding to her request for a recommendation into ASCAP in 1934. And it is distressing to see a similar correspondence with no resolution 6 years later in 1940, illustrating how long and how hard she had to work to become a member of ASCAP. It is interesting to note that Carpenter this time pledges his support again, but also asks her for a favor. And the favor is to meet Marian Anderson. You see, Anderson and Price were connected through Margaret Bonds and through Anderson's performances of Price's spiritual settings. Not surprisingly, Price didn't skip a beat and wrote Marian Anderson the next day. She also had a bit of a sense of humor about it when she says, "And now my joy would be complete if I could witness his being bowled over by that breathtaking radiation of your poise, unaffected culture, and sincerity that bowls over all who come in your presence. I would therefore like to present, quote, the great American composer to, quote, the world's greatest singer, and then stand back and revel in his well-concealed admiration for you." She was persistent and, of course, eventually became a successful published member of ASCAP. She maintained close relationships with the best Black musicians of the day. We see here an attempt to meet up with tenor Roland Hayes while he was touring throughout the Midwest. She also stayed well connected with members of the National Association of Negro Musicians and held close associations with musical and verbal artists like Nathaniel Dett, Margaret Bonds, and Langston Hughes. She published many of her works in her lifetime, and here is one such example of the inclusion of her pieces in the Oxford piano method. Also in this collection, you'll note the appearance of another famous Chicago organist and composer, Leo Sowerby. Price made her professional career in Chicago and found solace and sisterhood in the Chicago Club of Women Organists. They played concerts for each other and helped disseminate each other's music. You can see from this advertisement with the Chicago AGO that she invested in promoting her own music. I believe it is incredibly important to acknowledge and appreciate Price as a musical entrepreneur, an angle not frequently covered in her public story. Those who are interested in reading more about her life are encouraged to read things like Alex Ross's feature in The New Yorker entitled The Rediscovery of Florence Price, or the seminal biography recently released by the late musicologist Ray Linda Brown entitled The Heart of a Woman. Now on to some talk about the organ works. The organ works of Florence Price can be divided into two categories: larger concert works as well as shorter organ pieces. There is no greater authority on her organ music than Calvert Johnson, and I highly commend his editions of her organ music from Clarnon Editions. The series has just recently released the 5th volume of her organ works. These scholarly editions of the organ works feature wonderful notes and valuable background information on the organs Price would have known. Her larger works for organ consist of pieces such as the Sonata, her Suite No. 1, although no second suite appears to be in existence, her Passacaglia Fugue, and her variations on a folk tune. They all make great recital pieces. It is important to note, though, that sometimes smaller movements from larger works can be extracted as individual pieces. For example, one could extract the air and toccato from the Suite No. 1 as a prelude and postlude, respectively, for a worship service. The exquisite air is quite accessible from a technical standpoint, and the toccato, yes, that word does end in an O in her score, is a thrilling juba, a type of African dance rhythm found frequently in Price's music. She once described the use of the juba in a letter about her 3rd symphony. Quote, "In all of my works which have been done in the sonata form with Negroid idiom, I have incorporated a juba as one of the several movements because it seems to me to be no more impossible to conceive of Negroid music devoid of the spiritualist in theme on the one hand, than the strongly syncopated rhythms of the juba on the other." Florence Price's shorter organ works are a veritable treasure trove. Let's consider 2 pieces she published with Lorenz, Adoration and Offertory. Adoration is one of the more frequently performed pieces of hers today, with many recordings available online. Both pieces have religious titles and feature Price's characteristic harmony and a relatively easy level of difficulty. Here now the first few measures of the offertory. I have here a picture of a manuscript score that predates the score that I'm playing from, which is the newly published score. So there will be some note discrepancies that you'll hear. One of the things to note here is a performance practice in phrasing, where the ends of the phrases taper and slow down, and then immediately get renewed a tempo with the next phrase. This technique is very common in music of the time, and perhaps might even hint at some theater organ experience from Price. Here is an excerpt with a slightly similar harmonic language of another charming piece entitled Allegretto. Now, you might think that you have Price's musical language figured out, but not so fast. You will see in this next piece, Festal March, in the opening, she had full command of the tradition of composers like Edward Elgar. So you can see that piece would make a great processional for church or graduations and the like. Another popular shorter work that we don't have time for today, but worth considering, is her work entitled In Quiet Mood. Price's thrilling organ sonata almost sounds as an homage to the great French composer, Alexandre Guilmant. The monumental Suite No. 1, altogether different, shows many different sides to Price in its 4 movements, entitled Fantasy, Fugetta, Air, and Toccato. Here is a performance from the beginning of Suite No. 1. It's hard to believe that we are coming to the close of this session. There are so many other pieces we could talk about. It feels as if we're just getting started. And perhaps that is where the real power of these Pipe Talks shines through, piquing our interest. My hope is this presentation inspired some interest in you to read, listen, and play the organ music of Florence Price, a beautiful part of our rich American tapestry of organ music. Thank you.